My name is Claire Ashford. I'm 36 years old, and on a Tuesday in March, I opened my front door and found my mother standing on the porch with a suitcase at her feet and a single folded sheet of paper in her hand. She hadn't called first. She hadn't called at all, not for 7 years, not once, not for either of my children's birthdays, not the year my husband nearly lost everything, not the year after that when he didn't. She held the paper out to me the way you'd hand someone a form to sign at a bank counter, and I could see, before I even opened it, that it wasn't a letter. It was a list, 5 lines, and a number at the bottom, underlined twice. But this story really starts 7 years before that porch, the summer I turned 29, the summer my mother told me I was choosing wrong, and meant it as a kindness. I'm a claims investigator. 11 years now, most of them in the Special Investigations Unit, which is a polite name for the department that reads 600 pages of somebody else's story and finds the one paragraph that doesn't add up. I am good at my job. I have always been good at noticing what a person leaves out. My mother didn't raise her voice when she told me she wouldn't be coming to my wedding. She said it the way you'd read someone their balance at a bank counter. Flat, final, already reconciled in her own mind. You can marry him, she said, or you can stay my daughter. I don't see how you do both. I didn't cry. I didn't ask her to take it back. I said, okay, and I meant a very different okay than the one she heard. What none of them knew, not my mother, not my father, not my sister smiling politely beside her, was that I had already started keeping score, not out of spite, out of habit. It's what I do for a living. By the time my mother showed up on that porch, there were 41 index cards pinned to a corkboard in my home office, one for nearly every month that mattered, each one dated in my own handwriting. And standing there with that list in her hand, I remember thinking she was about to become card 42. 6 weeks before that porch, a man my mother had spent 7 years calling the mechanic, never Owen, never my son-in-law, just the mechanic, the way you'd name a tool instead of a person, sold the regional freight company he'd built from one tow truck for $29 million. And by the time this story is over, you'll understand exactly why my mother came for that list on a Tuesday in March, and not one single day before. Nobody in my family ever saw it coming from quiet, reasonable Claire. I was always the one who never made a scene. Welcome back to Calm Stories, where the ones who kept the peace for everyone else finally tell you the whole thing, calmly, start to finish. If a quiet kind of justice is your thing, settle in, drop a comment, and tell me where you're watching from tonight. And hit subscribe so you don't miss how this one ends. Let me back up. I grew up in Colby Springs, a town of about 6,200 people, with one real grocery store, one Presbyterian church, and a country club that mattered far more to my mother than its membership rolls ever justified. My father, Roland, ran the finance office at the regional hospital for 31 years, and never once, in 31 years, arrived later than 7:10 in the morning. My mother, Marlene, didn't have a job so much as a portfolio, the hospital auxiliary, the spring garden tour, the scholarship dinner committee, and somewhere in the running of all of it, she had come to believe that the Doyle family's standing in Colby Springs was an asset she was personally responsible for protecting, the way another woman might protect a pension. My sister Tessa was 2 years younger and effortless in every way I wasn't. She sold real estate the way other people breathe, and she had a gift for saying exactly the right thing to exactly the right person at exactly the right dinner. I was the one who noticed things, who counted, who checked, who kept the receipts, literally and otherwise. My mother used to say it fondly, back when I was a teenager, and it still sounded like a compliment. Claire keeps us honest. I don't think she meant it as a warning to herself. I think she just forgot she'd ever said it. Then I met Owen Ashford. He fixed my car on the shoulder of Route 9 on a Tuesday when I was 26, driving home from a claim site with a dead alternator and no idea what that meant. He had grease to the elbow and a tow truck with his own name painted on the door by hand because he couldn't afford a sign yet. He talked to me for 40 minutes while he worked, about nothing important, the the way you talk to someone when you've already decided you like the sound of their voice. He was kind in a way that had nothing to do with who was watching. I liked him before I liked anything about him that would have shown up on a resume. My mother met him exactly twice before the wedding. Both times, she called him the mechanic to my face, and something else, I learned much later, behind my back. She never claimed Owen was a bad man. She told me so, more than once, which somehow made it worse instead of better, as if the problem had never been Owen at all, only the picture the two of us made standing next to each other. She simply didn't think he belonged in the family photograph that ran in the Colby Springs paper every year at the scholarship dinner, everyone in matching navy, my father's arm around my mother, the Doyle name printed underneath in a serif font she'd chosen herself, years before, from a binder of samples. 3 weeks before the wedding, she sat me down at her kitchen table, the one with the good tablecloth, the one she only used for company, and told me, calmly, that if I married him, she wouldn't be there, and neither would my father, and I should think very carefully about whether that was the hill I wanted to build a life on top of. I told her it wasn't a hill, it was just my life. She didn't come, neither did he. My side of the aisle was full. Theirs held 6 folding chairs, and only Owen's mother sat in one of them. I noticed the chairs before I noticed almost anything else that day. I'd stood in the little side room of the venue, going over the seating one more time, the way I go over everything one more time, and I remember thinking that 6 empty folding chairs take up exactly as much space as 6 full ones. Nobody warns you about that. You expect absence to be smaller than presence, somehow, and it isn't. It's the same size. It just sits there being obviously the wrong color for the rest of the room. Her name was Dorothy Kessler. Everyone called her Dot. She'd taught 2nd grade in Colby Springs for 26 years, and she showed up to my wedding in a lavender dress she'd altered herself, sat in the 3rd row alone, and cried through the entire ceremony, in the specific, unembarrassed way of a woman who had decided, a long time ago, that love was worth being obvious about. Afterward, she hugged me for what felt like a full minute and said, "Well, now I've got a daughter too." I didn't know yet how much that sentence was going to end up mattering. The very next Sunday, Dot called and asked if we'd come by for dinner. "Nothing fancy," she said, "just a roast, and whoever was around." We went, mostly because we didn't have anywhere else to be that first strange, quiet weekend of being married and disowned in the same breath. She set 5 places at a table built for 4, said grace like she'd been doing it her whole life because she had, and asked me real questions about my job, my week, the drive over, the way you'd ask someone you actually intended to know for the next 40 years. We went back the next Sunday, and the one after that. Neither of us ever officially decided it was a standing thing. It simply became one, the way the truest traditions always do, without a single conversation about it. That night, back at the apartment Owen and I could barely afford, I found a shoebox in the closet, old, from a pair of boots I'd donated years before, and I put the wedding invitation my mother had returned unopened inside it, along with the folded place cards from the 6 empty folding chairs. I don't know why. I told myself it wasn't sentimental. I told myself it was just what I did with paperwork that didn't resolve cleanly. Card 1, though I didn't call it that yet. A month later, still raw in a way I didn't want to admit to anyone, I sat down one night and wrote my parents a letter that said everything I actually thought. Every year of being the reliable one, while Tessa got to be the beloved one, every small slight I'd talked myself out of noticing at the time because noticing it felt disloyal. It ran 4 pages, front and back. My college roommate, Camille, stayed on the phone with me until midnight while I read it to her, and she told me it was honest and well-earned, and that I should sleep on it before I mailed it. I did. In the morning, I read it again, folded it into an envelope, and put it in the bottom drawer of my desk instead of the mailbox. I told myself I'd send it once I'd cooled off. I never did. It's still in that drawer today, unsent. 4 pages of a version of me that wanted to win an argument instead of simply live a life. I kept it the same way I kept everything else. Not because I needed it, because I didn't trust myself to remember, years later, exactly how much I'd had a right to say. The first Christmas, I mailed a card. It came back 3 weeks later with return to sender written across the front in my mother's own hand, the same handwriting from the seating chart she'd once let me help address, back when I was still allowed to be useful to her in small ways. I recognized the slant of her R's immediately. I put it in the shoebox. Card 2. I called the house in February that year, on my father's birthday, because I thought, foolishly, I can admit now, that a birthday might be different than a holiday. My mother answered. I said hello. And then there was nothing. Not a hang-up, just silence. Sustained, deliberate. Long enough that I started counting without meaning to. The way you count anything you're bracing yourself against. I counted 11 seconds before she hung up. It's what I do. I didn't know yet that I'd be counting a very different silence, on a very different day, 7 years later. Or that this time, I'd be the one making someone else wait through it. By the time our first anniversary passed, the shoebox had become, unofficially, a project. I bought a corkboard at the hardware store on a Saturday afternoon and mounted it in the corner of what would eventually be my home office because shoeboxes don't scale, and neither, it turned out, did my mother's silence. Owen never once asked me to stop. He asked me a single time, gently, standing in the doorway with 2 mugs of coffee, whether he thought it was healthy, keeping all of it where I could see it. I told him the truth, because it was the only thing I had to offer him that year, besides rent money. It wasn't about hoping. It was about refusing to let anyone, ever, rewrite what actually happened to me based on what they wished had happened instead. I read insurance files for a living. I'd spent 2 years by then learning exactly how easily a story reshapes itself in the retelling, how a claimant will swear, in perfect good faith, to a version of events that the paperwork simply does not support. I didn't trust a story I couldn't document. That included my own, eventually. Especially my own. Owen bought a second truck that year and hired his first employee, a 19-year-old named Nathan, who'd failed out of the community college's diesel program twice and just needed one person, anywhere, to believe he could pass it a third time. Owen believed him. He was right. Nathan passed that spring and has run Owen's Route 9 yard for 6 years now. I got promoted into the Special Investigations Unit that same season. The youngest investigator in the department's history, they told me, though nobody ever throws a party for that kind of youngest. My first real file was a fire claim that didn't add up by $11,000 and a receipt dated 4 days after the store that issued it had closed for good. I found it because I read the whole file twice instead of once, the way I read everything twice. Nobody from Colby Springs proper, nobody who mattered to my mother anyway, ever heard about either thing, mine or Owen's, because there was no one left in that house who was still asking. Our daughter, Wren, was born in the spring of our 3rd year. I mailed the announcement myself, a small card with her footprint on the front, to the house on Maple Terrace where I'd grown up. It came back 3 weeks later, forwarding sticker still attached, the envelope slid open cleanly along the top edge, and then resealed with a strip of tape that didn't quite match the original glue. She'd read it, and folded it back along its original crease, and sent it home anyway. I pinned it to the wall exactly as it was, tape and all. Card 11. Dot was at the hospital before I'd even finished the paperwork. She brought a blanket she'd knit herself, pale yellow because we hadn't wanted to know in advance, and she held Wren like she'd been waiting her whole life for the chance, which, I understood later, she genuinely had. That's what a grandmother looks like, I remember thinking, watching her hum something wordless into my daughter's ear, in a hospital chair too small for her. And then I went home 3 days later and pinned an unopened, resealed envelope to a corkboard instead of a photograph, because that was the truth of what I actually had from the other side, and I had promised myself, somewhere in that shoebox year, that the wall would only ever hold the truth. I made one exception that year, the kind of exception you make when you are 29 days postpartum and lonelier than you'll admit to anyone, including yourself. Tessa texted asking to see the baby. Just once, she said. Just family. I said yes before I'd fully thought it through, and she came by on a Tuesday afternoon with a gift bag and a phone she never quite put down. She held Wren in my kitchen, took several photos of both of us. Me, exhausted, unguarded, hair unwashed, genuinely smiling for the first time in weeks because someone with my mother's exact cheekbones was finally looking at my daughter with something like warmth, and left an hour later with a promise to come back soon that neither of us believed. I didn't hear from her again for 4 years. I didn't think about that visit again for almost as long. I had no idea yet what that photograph was going to be used for, or by whom, or how far it would eventually travel, or that I had just handed the one image of myself I would come to regret the most directly to the person most likely to use it. By the 4th year, I'd stopped expecting anything to change, but I hadn't stopped documenting it, and there's a difference between those two things that took me a long time to understand myself. At a baby shower for a friend from high school, a woman named Meredith Okonkwo pulled me aside near the drinks table, clearly uncomfortable, turning her cup in her hands, the way people do right before they tell you something they've decided you deserve to know. She said she'd been at the hospital auxiliary luncheon the week before. Someone had asked my mother, lightly, how the girls were doing. My mother had smiled. Meredith did the smile for me, which was somehow worse than being told about it, and said that Tessa had always had better judgment, that at least Tessa hadn't married down. I almost didn't tell you, Meredith said, but I'd want to know. I didn't cry at that party. I thanked her, meant it, and drove home with both hands steady on the wheel. I added the line to a card that night, dated, sourced, exactly as she'd relayed it to me, word for word. Card 19. People sometimes ask why I kept doing this, why a person would spend years cataloging her own family's cruelty instead of simply walking away and refusing to look back. I've thought about the honest answer a long time, and it's this. I don't trust a version of events I can't hold in my hands. Not my mother's, and not even, eventually, my own memory of it, softened by time, the way memory tends to soften things in whichever direction lets you keep sleeping at night. The wall was never about revenge. It was about making sure that if the day ever came when someone tried to tell a different story about what had happened to me, I would have the receipts to say otherwise. I didn't know yet how literally that would come true. Our son Silas was born the following year, and something in me had gone quiet by then. Not healed, exactly, just quiet. The way a wound stops being a wound and becomes simply a shape you've learned to live around without flinching every time you brush against it. I mailed no announcement that time. I already knew what would happen to it, and I'd decided I didn't need the data point badly enough to watch it come back. It was that same year I ran a small, deliberate test, though I didn't think of it that way until much later. I mentioned to an old high school friend, over coffee, casually, that Owen's company was doing unbelievably well. True, but I let the word unbelievably do more work than the facts yet strictly supported. Within 2 weeks, secondhand, through a cousin named Paulette who still spoke to both sides of my family, I heard that my mother had repeated a version of that sentence at the auxiliary, considerably inflated, considerably proud, as though she'd been the one to hear it from me directly, instead of fourth hand through a grapevine she wasn't supposed to still have access to. It confirmed something I'd suspected but never proven. The silence had never meant disinterest. Someone was still listening. Someone was still counting, exactly like I was, only they were counting what I might someday be worth to them, and I was counting everything I'd already lost. The following spring, I learned about my sister's wedding from a tagged photograph online. Not an invitation, a photograph, after the fact, of a wedding I hadn't been told was happening, at a venue 40 minutes from my own front door, close enough that I could have smelled the same lake. I sent a gift anyway, a set of the same everyday dishes Owen and I had registered for ourselves. Unremarkable, sincere, wrapped in brown paper because I'd run out of anything nicer, and hadn't wanted to wait a day longer to send it. It came back to me 11 days later, faster than anything my mother had ever returned, and the tape on the box had been cut and resealed with a different roll than the one I'd used to wrap it, a slightly yellower tape, cheaper, the kind you'd find in a junk drawer rather than a gift wrapping closet. I sat with that box a long time before I understood what it meant. Owen sat with me. He didn't say much, which is one of the things I have always loved about him. He has never once tried to explain my own family to me, only to sit close by while I worked it out myself. My mother's silence had always arrived slowly, deliberately, over weeks, considered from every angle before it was ever mailed. This had come back in under 2 weeks, cut open in a hurry by someone who clearly hadn't wanted to be caught looking inside, and resealed with whatever tape happened to be closest. It was my father. I didn't have proof yet, not real proof, but I had a working theory, and working theories are exactly what my job trains me to build before I go looking for the paperwork to support them. For 7 years I had assumed my mother and father moved as a single unit, a united front, equally resolved, equally silent. That box told me otherwise. Somewhere in that house, someone had wanted to look inside the gift his estranged daughter sent his other daughter, and hadn't wanted his wife to know he'd looked. I pinned the box's shipping label to the wall, card 33. Generosity that keeps a due date isn't generosity, I remember thinking that night. It's just an invoice that took its time arriving. The spring of our 7th year, the Colby Springs Courier ran a short business item, 3 paragraphs on page 6, about a regional freight company being courted for acquisition by a national carrier. It didn't name me, it barely named Owen. 1 sentence, founder Owen Ashford declined to comment on the reported figures. But 3 days later, my cousin Paulette forwarded me a post from my mother's social media. An old family photograph, the 4 of us at some scholarship dinner a decade earlier, matching navy, my father's arm around her shoulders, captioned with a line about how proud she'd always been of the family she'd raised. How family was everything. How blood always finds its way back together in the end, no matter how far it wanders. I read it standing in my own kitchen, Silas at the table behind me eating cereal, and for the first time in 7 years, I felt something closer to anger than grief. Not because the caption was cruel, because it wasn't. It was warm and public and entirely fictional, and I understood, reading it, that she had started rehearsing a version of this story that didn't have a single one of my 38 index cards in it. 2 weeks after that, Dot's niece, a young woman named Ashley who did marketing part-time for Tessa's real estate office, sent me a screenshot she swore afterward she hadn't meant to send. A family group chat, the 3 of them, my mother, my father, and Tessa, discussing, in careful, deliberate language, the right way to reach out now. Tessa had written that they should get ahead of it, her words, before Claire thinks we only want something. My mother had responded that appearances mattered, that whatever happened needed to look natural, needed to look like love and not like timing. I read it twice, standing at my own counter, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that the 7 years of silence had never been about principle at all. It had been about waiting for a number large enough to be worth the apology. Stay with me. The part that changed everything is coming. And it is worth every minute of the wait. So hit subscribe right now so you don't miss exactly how she walked back through that door. Owen and I already had a meeting scheduled with our attorney the following week, unrelated to any of this, just the ordinary paperwork that comes with selling a company you built with your own hands, out of a single tow truck. Our attorney, a careful, unhurried man named Everett Pruitt, listened to the acquisition terms, nodded, made a few notes, and then asked a question that had nothing to do with the sale at all. He asked whether we had an estate plan for the children. We didn't, not really. We'd meant to, the way everyone means to. Within 3 weeks, on his advice, we'd set up an irrevocable trust for Wren and Silas's education, funded and untouchable by anyone including us, and moved the house and our savings into a holding company neither of our names appeared on directly. This isn't really about your mother, Everett told us, not unkindly, sliding the papers across his desk for our signatures. This is just what people do, once a number gets this size. But it wouldn't hurt anything either, given what you've told me. I signed my name in 4 places and thought about a shoebox full of returned mail, and understood, signing it, that by the time anyone in my family ever asked me for anything, there would already be nothing here for them to reach. They just didn't know that yet. Nobody did, except Owen, Everett, and me. 3 weeks after the group chat, Tessa called. Her voice had a warmth in it I hadn't heard directed at me since before the wedding. Easy, familiar, apologetic in a general, unspecific way that never actually named a single thing she was apologizing for. She wanted to get coffee. Just us, just sisters, she said, like the word still meant to her what it used to mean to me. I said yes, on my own terms. A diner on the public highway, 90 minutes. Owen waiting in the car in the lot outside because some part of me, even then, wasn't willing to be alone with any of them without a witness close by. I ordered coffee I didn't finish and let her talk. She asked, over the course of that hour and a half, whether we were happy with how the deal had structured out, whether we'd bought anything yet, a bigger house, somewhere new, whether Owen had plans for the money, said exactly like that. In quotation marks I could hear, even though she never used her fingers to make them. She asked 11 separate questions that circled the same subject from 11 different directions, refilling her own coffee twice while she did it. And in 90 minutes, my sister, who had held my daughter exactly once, 4 years earlier, in my own kitchen, never once asked what Ren and Silas's laughs sounded like, or what they were learning in school, or whether they'd want a real aunt if she ever decided to become one. Near the end, when she finally asked outright what our number had ended up being, I set my cup down and told her, I'm not going to talk numbers with you, Tessa. That's a complete sentence. I let it sit there, unfinished on purpose, the way she'd left so many things unfinished with me for 4 years, and I noted the whole conversation the way I note everything. Card 40. There is a kind of gossip network in a town the size of Colby Springs that runs on the same fuel as a courtroom, and for 30 years, my mother had been one of its most careful operators, deciding, luncheon by luncheon, exactly what the town believed about the Doyle family, curating it the way another woman might curate a garden, pruning back anything that didn't match the picture. What she never accounted for was that the same network doesn't only carry the story you feed it, it also carries what it can independently verify, and over 7 years, quietly, without any effort on my part at all, it had verified a great deal. It had watched Dot Kessler stand up at church nearly every single week and mention her daughter-in-law and grandchildren without fail, the way you'd mention weather. It had watched Owen's trucks multiply along the highway, his name stitched onto real uniforms now, instead of painted on a door by hand. And it had noticed, the way small towns always eventually notice, that Marlene Doyle's elder daughter and her 2 grandchildren had not been seen inside the Presbyterian church, or the scholarship dinner, or a single family photograph, in 7 full years. By the time my mother needed that network to believe her version of the story, it had already quietly started asking its own questions instead, in the exact unhurried, permanent way small towns ask questions nobody ever officially answers. Paulette told me, months later, that at that same scholarship dinner, a woman on the garden tour committee had asked my mother, not unkindly, whether Claire and the children might make it to Christmas this year, now that things were going so well for everyone. My mother had said we were simply very busy, that success does that to a young family, that we'd all sit down together soon. The woman had nodded and said nothing else, but Paulette said the table went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with rudeness and everything to do with math. The kind of quiet where a room full of people who have known you your whole life quietly subtracts your story from what they've actually observed and keeps the difference to themselves. My mother had spent 30 years teaching Colby Springs exactly how closely to watch a family's appearance. She'd simply never planned on being read that closely herself. 3 days after the acquisition became public, my father called. Not my mother. Him, alone, for the first time in 7 years. I almost didn't answer. His number still showed up in my phone, under a name I hadn't updated since college, Dad, work. And seeing it flash on the screen at 9 at night made my hands go strange for a second before I picked up. He said 4 words before anything else. I'm proud of you. And then nothing, for a moment, the kind of nothing that sounded entirely different than the silence I remembered from that February phone call years before. I didn't forgive him in that moment. I want to be honest about that, because this isn't a story where every door opens the same amount, or on the same day, or for the same reasons. But I noticed the difference in his voice, and I wrote it down, because that's what I do with anything that might matter later. And then it was a Tuesday in March, and I opened my front door, and there she was. She was wearing the same wool coat she'd worn to that kitchen table conversation 7 years earlier, the one about hills and lives, gray, a little more worn at the cuffs than I remembered, and I understood, looking at it, that we had arrived, finally, back at the beginning, the suitcase by her feet, the folded paper in her hand, held out exactly the way she had every form, every invoice, every seating chart of her entire life, already reconciled in her own mind before I'd read a single word of it. I didn't take her into the living room. I took her past it, down the hall, into the room with the wall. I set out 2 mugs, the everyday ones we used on ordinary Tuesdays, not the good set we kept in the cabinet for company, and I watched her notice that, and say nothing about it, and sit down anyway, her spine perfectly straight the way it had been at every dinner table of my entire childhood. She handed me the list again, as though the porch hadn't already happened once, 30 seconds earlier, as though repeating the gesture indoors might make it land differently the second time. 5 lines. A renovation estimate for a guest suite. A monthly household stipend, unspecified duration, reinstatement as an emergency contact, and as a named beneficiary. A line, almost unbelievably, about the cost of an updated family portrait sitting, so the photograph that ran every year in the Courier could finally be current again. A total at the bottom, $186,400, underlined twice in blue ink that had bled slightly into the paper's fibers. I didn't answer the list, not yet. I turned to the wall instead. "I have something to show you first," I said, and I started reading the cards out loud, in order, chronologically, the way I read a claims file to a review board, flat, unembellished, every date stated plainly, every fact kept separate from every feeling I might once have attached to it. The returned wedding invitation, the Christmas card marked in her own hand, the 11 seconds of silence on my father's birthday, which I told her I had counted, because I count things, because it's what I do. Her first response came quickly, well-worn, clearly rehearsed over 7 years of telling herself the same sentence until it had smoothed itself into something she could say without flinching. "You were the one who left, Claire. You made your choice at that table." "I made a choice," I agreed. "You made the rules I was choosing inside of." I turned to the next card. The baby shower comment, sourced, dated, the exact words relayed to me by a woman who'd felt too uncomfortable to stay quiet about it. My mother said she didn't recognize the phrasing, said people misremember things, especially at parties, especially after wine. Said it the way you'd dispute a line item on a bill you were fairly confident no one could actually produce a receipt for. So I produced the receipt. Not the group chat yet. 1 card further back, a note from that same week, Meredith's name and the date written in the corner. My mother's mouth went tight at the edges, but she held her ground. "That's one woman's memory of one conversation," she said. "You built a filing system out of gossip. I built a filing system out of things people were willing to put their names next to," I said. "That's more than you've ever offered me." Then I showed her the group chat, printed, not a screenshot on a phone she could later claim she hadn't really seen clearly, paper, in her hand, her own words about appearances and timing, and getting ahead of it before Claire thinks we only want something. Something in her face changed then, and it wasn't guilt. It was anger, sharp and immediate, the exact tone I remembered from being 14 years old and finding the receipt for a birthday gift she'd sworn, for 2 straight years, she'd made by hand herself. She said I had no right to that conversation, that it had been private, that people were allowed to talk to each other about difficult things without a daughter treating it like evidence. She did not say it was untrue. I noticed that she never once said it was untrue. She tried a different angle after that, the way a good negotiator will always try a different angle once the first one stops working. Her voice softened, dropped into a register I hadn't heard directed at me since I was maybe 9 years old. She reminded me of a summer at the lake house, of teaching me to float on my back, of a version of the two of us that I do actually remember, that did actually happen, that I have never once tried to pretend away. We had good years, Claire, she said. Don't let this list erase all of that. I'm not erasing anything, I told her. That's the entire point of the wall. I kept the lake house too. It's card 4. I kept everything, Mom. That was never the problem. The problem is you only ever wanted me to keep the parts that made you look like a good mother. And I don't get to edit my own life down to your highlight reel, just because you're standing in my office asking nicely. I have a letter upstairs, I told her then, quietly, that I wrote about a month after the wedding. 4 pages. It says everything I actually felt back then, without any of the parts where I've since learned to be careful with you. I never sent it. I decided, somewhere around card 30, that you didn't get that version of me either. You're getting this one instead. I'd think about which one is the mercy. I saved the last card for last. Ren's birth announcement, the envelope with the forwarding sticker still attached, slit cleanly along the top, and resealed with tape that never quite matched. I laid it on the desk between us and said nothing at all, because for the first time in the whole conversation, I didn't need to. She looked at it a long time, long enough that I watched her throat move, once, twice, the way it does right before someone says something they didn't plan to. I don't even know what their laughter sounds like, she said, so quietly I almost missed it, and for 1 second, one single second, I nearly reached across the desk for her hand, the way I would have without a moment's hesitation 20 years earlier. Then she rearmed. I watched her do it, watched the softness leave her face like a tide going back out. After everything we sacrificed to raise you. That's not a debt, I said. That's what parents do. Owen came in partway through, having been down the hall with Dot and the kids the entire time, close enough to hear if I'd needed him, far enough to let this belong to me first. He didn't say a word. He crossed the room, sat on the arm of my chair, and put his hand on my shoulder, and stayed there, a man in jeans and a company polo with his own name stitched over the pocket now, instead of painted on a truck door by hand, exactly as unremarkable and exactly as real as he had always been, on the worst day of the wedding and on this one. My mother looked at him for a long moment, longer than she'd ever looked at him directly in 9 years of knowing him existed. She had nothing left to say, not because I'd out-argued her, because she'd finally, after everything, run out of material. I addressed the list last. I approve or deny 6-figure claims for a living, I told her. I don't work off what someone tells me happened. I work off what I can prove happened. Today, for the first time, I used that on my own family, and I'm not going to pretend that doesn't cost me something. But I'm not turning this down to punish you. I'm turning it down because the day I let you write a check into this family, you'd have a story where you were generous and I was difficult, and I am not giving you that story. You don't get to buy the ending, Mom. And you should know, there was nothing here for you to reach even before you wrote this list. We handled that weeks ago, before the group chat, before any of this. You just didn't know it yet, and that tells me everything the list itself doesn't. I let a long silence sit before I told her the terms. I counted it, the way I count everything. 19 seconds. I'd counted 11 once, a long time ago, on a phone call that ended before I ever got a word out. I wanted her to feel every one of these, all the way to the end, the way I had. Any apology, I told her, would go to Owen and the children first, not to me, and it would have to be earned across actual time, not delivered on the same day as a demand. Contact, if it happened at all, would start small, occasional, unsupervised by anything but its own consistency over months, and there would be no visits, not yet, possibly not for a long while yet to come. She stood, picked up her suitcase, and left the way she'd arrived, without raising her voice, because my mother has never once in her life needed volume to make a point. The door closed quietly behind her, a click, not a slam. I'd had 7 years to decide I didn't need the slam. If any of this is hitting close to home for you tonight, drop a comment and hit subscribe. We're almost to how it all finally settled. 2 weeks passed before anything else happened. My father called first, alone, the way he had the week the acquisition became public. He didn't ask for anything. He apologized, specifically, not for the wedding itself, he said, but for the 11 seconds of silence on that February phone call, which he remembered exactly as I did, down to the fact that it had been his own birthday he let go unanswered. He said he'd gone along with 7 years of silence to keep peace at his own kitchen table, and that he understood now, hearing how the visit had gone from my mother's own clipped account of it, exactly what that peace had cost, and precisely who had paid for all of it. He didn't mention the money once, not even in passing. I told him he could call once a month, for now, and that visits were a bridge we'd build later, slowly, load-tested, before anyone actually walked across it. He said that was fair, more than fair. He has called every month since, on the same day, like a man who has learned, late, the value of showing up on a schedule. Tessa texted 3 days after my mother's visit, once she'd heard secondhand how it went. One line, unrepentant, must be nice to finally have the money to be a bigger person than the rest of us. I didn't answer. I didn't add it to the wall either. Some things, I've decided, don't even earn a card. My mother has not called. I don't know if that changes. I've stopped needing it to. I told you, at the beginning of this, that she was about to become card 42. I was wrong. And I've decided I don't mind being wrong about that particular thing. The wall still says 41. I haven't added her visit to it, and I don't think I will. Some ledgers, I've learned, are more honest left open than closed. Not because I'm still waiting for something to change, but because closing it would mean deciding, permanently, that it never could, and I'm not willing to call that decision progress. Not yet. Maybe not ever. That's allowed too. Sunday dinners happen at Dot's house now, every week, no exceptions, the way they have since the year I got married. Wren makes the chili from Dot's late husband's recipe herself now, measuring the paprika the exact careful way Dot taught her, standing on the same step stool Dot keeps by the stove for exactly that purpose. Silas sets the table without being asked, 6 places, even though we're only 5, because Dot always says you set 1 extra, just in case, and nobody in this family has ever once questioned why. Nobody at that table has ever asked me what anything costs. Family is not the people who share your address at Christmas. Family is not the people who remember your number the moment it becomes worth calling. Family is the people who show up when there is nothing at all in it for them, and keep showing up long after there's nothing in it for you either. That's my story. 41 cards, 1 company built out of a single tow truck on the side of Route 9, and a door I closed quietly instead of slamming, because I had finally, after 7 long years, stopped needing anyone to hear it slam. If you've spent years managing what somebody else thinks of you, at the cost of what's actually true, take this as your sign that you're allowed to stop keeping score on their behalf, starting today, with no letter required. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.